Hello, and welcome to episode 94 of the PowerScore LSAT podcast. I'm Dave Kaloran in Napa Valley.
And this is Jon Dinning in Los Angeles.
John, how's Los Angeles today?
Hot. It's been a heat wave here.
It's a California thing then, because I'm warm up here in Napa.
Yeah, I was just having spent last weekend basically in New York, where it was chillier. It's a bit of a change of pace.
How'd you like New York?
You know how I like New York. I love it. I adore Manhattan. It was a strange trip. One of my best friends who lived there has a 4-week-old daughter, and they made me hold her. And the girl I went to stay with had laryngitis the whole time, so she could barely speak.
COVID.
Come on. She actually had COVID and has been vaccinated, so she's about as safe a company as I'm going to get from that perspective.
I'll let that one go without further comment.
But yeah, it was fun, man. I love New York.
You know, New York's one of those cities where I love visiting, and they've got so many things that are just fantastic there, but I think I would have a difficult time living there. It's just a little bit too down in the canyons, too much concrete and steel for me.
Yeah, everything's piled on top of everything else. But having lived in LA for a while, you know what I miss? Just being able to walk around, man.
Yeah.
That was great.
That is one of the true advantages of living there, and it's just so much stuff, but there's also so many people.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, I think everybody knows that about New York, so I don't think we're breaking new ground.
What everybody doesn't know. What are you drinking?
I am drinking a rum punch today, which I think probably is reasonably predictable. If you spin the wheel of what I'm drinking, usually it has rum in it, and some kind of rum and fruit juice is often high on the list.
I feel like I've seen you order this drink before, so.
Yeah, you have. If I see it on a menu, I figure they must know what they're doing. You end up with like a little bit of light rum, a little dark rum, usually some kind of juices like pineapple or orange or something. Mm-hmm. It's pretty standard. What about you?
Well, also pretty predictable for me, especially given that I just got back from a trip with laryngitis, and then their infant has colic. It's coughing in my face. So I'm drinking bourbon neat, hoping my voice stays with us.
You sound pretty good to me, and
Thanks,
I know
man.
the listeners like the sound of your voice as well. Now, you've made the music choice today, and I object to it, of course, in the extreme. So why don't you talk about that?
All right. See if I can defend it. We were originally going to record this at the end of last week, I think on September 30th. And it occurred to me that is Trey Anastasio, the singer, songwriter, guitarist above all for the band Phish. And so I was like, well, give a shout out to Trey. And then I realized how much you hate jam bands. And that sealed it for me.
I do indeed. Don't get me in a jam band thing, because that's just the most boring music in the world to me.
It can meander a bit.
That's so diplomatic. It can meander. Yeah, it meanders for like 25 minutes. And I'm like, you know what? I'm going out to get another beer.
It can. The first song that came to mind from Phish, and I don't know if it's their biggest hit, because I don't know if they've ever had a hit, but it's a song called Bouncing Around the Room. And the reason I thought that was a little bit applicable today is that's what we really do with these mailbag episodes. Just kind of bounce from question to question. It's all over the place. So that song always makes me happy. It's Jouncy.
Well, that's a good segue. And the faster we can get away from Phish, the happier I will be. So let's move on to the LSAT world. What's been going on recently?
Well, I mean, the thing that has dominated at least a lot of our lives have been these new LSATs that just came out. Experimental for the original May test, and then 2 brand new tests, including experimentals. PT's 91 plus and 92 plus.
Yeah, just what I wanted was 9 sections released without warning. Because obviously one of the things we have to do is we have to classify it, work through it. They haven't even given us the files for it in kind of like final PDF form. It is actually a big task to deal with just out of the blue, especially at this time of year when we're already pretty busy.
Yeah.
So you've been spending a lot of time with that. I've been spending less time with it.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to complain too much. Personally, I can. But this was such a good thing for students who wanted more content. So,
yeah.
Happy news for the audience. Man, rough timing for us.
I'm thrilled for them. And eventually, when I have a chance to really kind of like immerse myself in some of the questions, I will appreciate it as well. It's just, I was expecting one test, not this much content, and then that puts just a huge amount of pressure on us. So I think it's a great thing that they did it. I compliment them on my own personal life level. it was unexpected and kind of like, oh man, that's just a lot of work right there.
Yeah. There's some good stuff in there, so when you get a chance, I know you'll at least appreciate it.
Oh yeah. Some of the things I've already worked through and I've been looking at, I really enjoy. I look forward to talking about them because obviously as time passes, I'm sure you and I will pull up some of these sections and talk about them, especially for like people who are taking the LSAT in the future and just kind of go through what we see with that. And that'll be fun. So we just have to get to that point, and that's not going to happen for a while, at least a month or two before we're able to sit down and do that just because our time schedules right now are pretty rough.
That's sadly true, sadly fair. That's not the only thing to get released, though.
Yeah. I woke up on Saturday morning bright and early because I knew that LSAC was releasing new data. In fact, the beginning data of this cycle was released on Saturday morning. It was updated earlier today. And so wanted to see what they would do. And it's really kind of weird. Like they update the data constantly throughout the year. And then when we get to this period, like August or so in September, they stop updating because the former cycle is closed and the new cycle hasn't opened up. But of course, what this means is we now have information on the number of applicants that they are seeing at this point, as well as the score performance at various levels, usually 5-point increments. So let's talk through that for a second, because I don't think a lot of people know this. I did tweet about it on Saturday, shortly after the data went up. The first thing is this: applications, in terms of the applicants themselves, are up. So last year you had about, at this point in time, there will be far more when it's all said and done, you had almost 7,000 applicants in the system last year. This year they've got 7,800 and change. So it is up early on 11.9%. Now the question is that a permanent rise or not? It's really tough to say. You know that there were a bunch of people who opted out of the last cycle. You would assume that those people would be in early on this cycle and underway. So it could just be that there is a boom occurring early on because of last year's weirdness, which if you're like, what are you talking about? We did an episode on this a while back about why last year's cycle was so brutal. So that was interesting because obviously the more applicants that you have to law school, the more competitive it becomes. And nobody was looking for a competitive year. I mean, we knew it was coming, but nobody wants it to actually come through. But this is telling us that what we expected to see, the early signs of it, at least in terms of applicant numbers, is bearing that out. It'll be a lot more interesting in 2 months when we have more data. This is very, very early. So if you're freaking out like, oh my God, not only is it a tough cycle last time, now there's even more people, this may not sustain. It may actually drop down.
It always puts it into perspective for me too. We talk a lot about the timing of the cycle. What's early, what's late, when you finally get yourself in trouble for stalling too long. You think about this, we've still got less than 8,000 people. It's October. If you take October, if you take November, the cycle may be higher, but it's still not this crush of people who just have outcompeted you by volume alone.
No. And this is like maybe a tenth of all applicants that we will ultimately see. So it's still very early. It's not as if you'd be watching a football game and when 10% of it's gone, be like, it's over. I have no idea how it's over. It's never going to get better. There's a lot of time left on the clock here. So, and this isn't necessarily unexpected, as I said before. The LSAT score data that came out along with it, kind of, I think, proved largely the point that you and I had been making for a while, that the bubble is not gone. And so for those of you who disagreed with us previously and said, oh, it's going to come down for sure because the test has changed and so forth, I think right now you're seeing that probably isn't really the case. And it's not huge, though. This is so early that it's really difficult to say that this is permanent as well. But I'll read off a few score ranges and tell you what kind of change we've seen. And it's going to sound ominous at first. And then what I'll do is I'll say, let's take a look at the actual numbers. And it's be like, wait, they're not that big. So if you were looking at students who scored 155 to 159, last year at this time, there were 1,016 of them. Now there's 1,288. That's an increase of 26.8%. So if you just listen to the percentage, you're like, woo, that's huge. But the numbers, it's about 250 more. That's a lot, but still that is early enough that it can change. 160 to 164, the increase is 17.2%. Last year there was 1,016, oddly the same number.
Yeah, I found that strange.
Yeah, this year there's 1,191. So it's up. Go to 165 to 169, the increase is 13.9%. Last year, there was 968 scores in that range. This year, 1,103. So again, the numbers relatively narrow, but still significantly different. And now we reach the 170s. Last year at this time, there were 735 scores in the 170 to 174 range. This year, there are 793, which is a 7.9% increase. And so you look at that range, and it's actually increased from 145 up to 155 as well. From 145 to 174, you've got a fairly significant increase overall. So now we reach that final level, the 175 to 180 boss level.
Can you hear it? Can you hear people holding their breath for this right now? I can hear it.
They're like, don't cut Dave off while he's saying.
Don't you dare say it went up again.
Down. It is down 8.2%, which is like, and a lot of people are like, hallelujah, get the high scores out of there. Get me into that high score, but get everyone else out of there. Here's the difference, though. Last year at this time, there were 304 scores in that range. This year, 279. So you are talking about 25 people is the difference there. That's not huge. This is why it's so early. It's really difficult to tell. Overall, though, scores appear to be up about, in terms of people in these ranges, 10.2%. And that's something to think about because you got more applicants and more scores. Those two things can work together. So we'll have to see how the numbers actually shake out over time. There's very difficult to make a judgment.
Yeah. For anybody who needed some extra October motivation, though, there you go.
Yes.
Yeah. You want to talk about the next two tests on the horizon?
Yeah. Please give me the rundown because I don't even know what month it is. You just said October, and I was like, wait, isn't it November? But it is indeed October. So I think I better leave this to you, man.
Fair enough. Yeah, obviously this coming weekend begins the October exam, which will run Saturday, Sunday, and then on Tuesday, some accommodations later in the week and a makeup test the following week. Yeah, I know you and I are both thrilled to go through that. We're going to do our best, as always, with the test, collect what we can, compile what we can, see if we can give you predictions that we feel good about. We'll see.
Yeah.
Following that is the November LSAT, the last one of the year. The most interesting thing about this is, one, the registration deadline's over. So you missed your window if you're not signed up there. But they have changed the days. I think for the first time I've ever seen, they're going to start it on a Friday. Which is November 12th. There. Yeah. Friday, Saturday, Sunday, the 12th through the 14th. Tuesday of that week for accommodations.
At least by Sunday night, it's over and done with.
We hope. That's pretty unusual scheduling, but that's what's going to happen in November. So again, if you were planning for something on that Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, change your plans.
Yeah, and we talked about that having something to do with Thanksgiving and the conflict there with scheduling and so forth. So we know why they did it. It wasn't arbitrary, like, we want to screw everybody's Friday. There was an actual reason to it.
Yeah, and then there's one other thing on our calendars coming right up, which is we're going to do another crystal ball webinar for the November test. When we did the one for October, we weren't sure if a second one was going to be needed. We've got 9 new LSAT sections since then. Gives us something to talk about, and we will. That is going to be free October 20th, 8 p.m. Eastern, and we'll run it very similarly to what we've done before, but on new data and new information.
Yeah, I think we're debating the changes we want to make to it. Still, we've obviously got, only 2 weeks.
2.5 weeks.
Change. Which is great. I'm not liking October, the month so far. Other than Halloween, which I love.
Me too.
The rest of this is terrible from a scheduling standpoint. That just sounds brutal. But either way, that'll be fun. And we always like to switch it up. So if you've been to one of the prior crystal balls, you'll see some similarities. But if you look carefully, and sometimes not so carefully, you can see we tend to make significant changes. And we've got more information now, so that's going to actually factor into this.
And we'll have even more after this October test week passes us by. So, yeah, that'll be fun. I'm looking forward to that, even though there's tons of work.
Yeah, that's always a lot more work. I think someone in our office said to me, hey, well, it's just the same thing, right? You guys, you just walk in and do it. I'm like, if only. You have no idea what it actually requires, especially when there's new information, because we have to process all that and then figure it out. And then even when we do 2 in a row that are similar, we don't like to do the same thing. So we end up switching it regardless and trying to present different information. So I'm like, there is no easy cakewalk here with these events. It's all rough. Anyway, that said, let's move on.
You ready to answer some questions?
I'll do my best. Hopefully you will as well.
Yeah, I'll see what I can contribute here. But I know a lot of these came directly to you through a couple different sources.
Yeah, I posted last week and I was like, hey, if you got an admissions question, I think I'm in the mood to answer them. Jon and I will take care of the questions on our podcast. And we got a lot of questions posted. So that was actually pretty cool. Let's open it up. We've kind of divided them into segments. The first segment is a little bit more about apps and timelines. And then the second segment is a little bit more about the components of an application and what have you. So, Jon, take it away, man.
Well, having just talked about the numbers and the applicants and the score bands and things, the first question that we have here has to do with the timeline of this, which asks if schools are going to milk those inflated scores, quote, until they run out. Is it actually better not to apply super early this year if your stats are more in line with previous usual medians? In other words, is there ever a good reason to wait that doesn't involve a better score or some opportunity?
It's funny. We talked about this a little bit, and one of the things that's come up is we already know this cycle is going to be slow. Schools don't know what's going to happen with the number of applicants or the number of LSAT scores, so they're chilling. They're not going to make immediate decisions and get themselves in trouble. So I don't think that it's, the inflated scores that would say you can wait. What I would say is it's just simply the environment that you're in that is going to make it so that applying at the very first minute is not that big of a deal. So that's the important point here is you don't have to apply in the first month and feel like, oh my gosh, if I don't do this, I'm completely out of luck. This is going to be a slower cycle. And on that basis alone, you've got more time. And already there's an overemphasis on applying instantaneously when the window opens. So I think both of those speak to the idea of like, hey, you're okay.
Yeah. One of the things I wanted to encourage people here today listening to this is that this is actually a part 2. We did a student question mailbag on admissions really recently. And one of the questions that we tackled there was about this idea. I think we even gave some specific examples of like, is it worth January to get 1 or 2 more points, for example? Yep. And the answer was a resounding yes. Yeah, a later test with better numbers always wins.
Yeah, they don't track your application date, but they do track your LSAT score. So which is the one do you think you want to change when you're applying? It's just the logic of the process. But there's so much misinformation out there that you hear all sorts of counter theories and what have you. I did want to comment a little bit about what this person said. If schools are going to milk those inflated scores until they run out. And I thought that was a very interesting assumption that this person made in the middle of this. I'm like, I read that and I thought to myself, until they run out, not, if they ever run out, but kind of like when they run out. And we don't know that's going to be the case. Right now, the data is showing that there is a bit of an inflation. It's very similar to what we've seen before. So you can't bank on the fact that scores are just automatically going to come down over time. Do I hope they do? Yeah, I'd like to see some normalcy return, but that's beyond anybody's control at this point. So the idea that they're going to run out and things are going to get better, do not presume that is going to be the case. There is no guarantee whatsoever, and early data is saying, in fact, it's not going to happen. So keep that in mind when you're making that decision.
Yeah, I see no reason to delay an application unless there's something you can improve about it. But if you're just sitting back waiting, hoping these schools, tire themselves out or something, run out of good candidates, I think you're going to be disappointed.
Look, if your app's ready on day one and you're very comfortable with it and don't think it can be any better, apply then.
Right.
It will not harm you. The reason to wait is if you think you can make your application better or some portion of it. That's the simple math here.
Perfect. You want to take the next one? You want me to read it? You?
I'll read it.
Okay.
So this is about early action, early decision kind of ideas. It says if you apply to a school binding early decision, meaning if they accept you, you have to go or not go to law school at all, and they don't accept you early, but then they transfer you into the regular decision pool. All right, so a common thing that happens. Does that mean your app is now late in the regular cycle? So essentially, is it a disadvantage going for early decision that if you don't get in, you get pushed to the regular decision pool and that somehow puts you into a later position? The answer to this is no. It is not a disadvantage to do this. In fact, it's an advantage to do it if this is the way that it actually plays out. And there are certainly scenarios where one would encourage someone to say, you probably aren't going to get in early decision. apply anyway, because when you don't get in, what happens is that early decision chance that you took goes along for the ride with the rest of your application throughout the remainder of the pool. When you get down to, say, I don't know, February or March, and they're looking at 2 applicants and they're worried about yield, they're worried about all these things, and it's you, an early decision person, versus someone else who wasn't early decision, in the back of their minds, you know what they're thinking? This person told us they wanted to go here. They really want to go here. So if we let them in, the chances of them coming here are really high. That cannot be downplayed in terms of its importance. It is kind of like the free rider effect. But either way, all that aside, if you don't get in early decision, they know that you applied early. So you don't all of a sudden become a later applicant. They've already looked at you. They just didn't think that you were going to make the early decision kind of like pool decision that they were going to make.
Yeah, that's good advice too. It reflects well on the applicant, even if it doesn't actually work in their favor time-wise.
That's exactly right.
Let's keep going. These are good questions. Let's do one about subject specialization. And this is something I think you probably have a little more knowledge on than I do. Let's see where it goes. Here's the question. If an applicant's profile is geared towards a certain field, like international law, corporate law, etc., will schools that are focused in that field see the student as an asset, a liability, or neither? On the other hand, if a student's great at a subject, something else, like how would that affect the way that schools view them? Things like advocacy, moot court, mock trial.
Well, let's be honest. If you're great at something, that's a positive. It doesn't really matter what the school is or what their specialization is. They're looking for people who are great at things and who actually have some degree of knowledge. Now, let's say that you're applying to NYU and you've got a background in taxation and have some understanding of tax law. Of course, they're going to think to themselves, this is good. This person is actually cut out for this. When they have specialized programs, it's not that they're looking for everybody to come in with knowledge in that field. And corporate law is a great example of this. Look, it's so broad, transactional law. People don't come in with like true specialties in that kind of zone. Right. You have to, typically you'd need some kind of experience doing it. But if you are looking at a program and they are really hyped on it and they think they have a solid program, who do you think they want to add to it? People who are stars in that field or are really good at it or have a really deep interest and are going to do things. I've always thought about this with sports law. If I were to go to law school, I would say to myself, let me find a really good sports law program, preferably at some place like UCLA where I could be in Los Angeles and, you know, near a bunch of people who actually are in the sporting field and what have you. And it would be really fun. Now, am I a perfect sports law candidate? No. It'd be like, maybe, but you don't look like the typical guy. So how they might actually look at me is mixed. They'd say, well, are you going to be a good law student or not? Do we think you could actually take the skills that you have in life and translate them into something more? Yeah, well, then I become a decent applicant. I don't have to have a deep sports background to get into those programs. Having it, though, shows commitment, shows interest, it shows breadth of experience. Those things are positive.
Yeah, it's a bit like a college major choice. You can pick the thing that interests you. You can pick the thing you're naturally good at or have some distinction in. You can choose schools based on what they offer that you want to chase. But no school's going to turn people down because of major differences or major discrepancies, right?
Yeah, it also reminds me of the fact that for many law schools, they put a kind of like a big grain of salt on this is what I want to do with my life, kind of essays and statements. Not to say that they're discounting. They're still reading them and they're still finding them interesting. And some of them are clearly written by people who are going down a certain pathway. Mm-hmm. But if somebody says, I really want to do this type of law, I think a lot of law schools will say, yes, but you don't really know a whole lot about that kind of law. And when you get here, you might find that you really hate it. You want to be a prosecutor. Well, I've had students who were like, I'm all hot on being a prosecutor. And they get there and they're like, I hate this. This is terrible. I feel like I'm not doing something that's helpful. And so they switch it entirely. And law schools know that. And that's okay.
That's okay.
You're not penalized for it.
Yeah. Cool. Let's talk about another one I like, which is school choice. I'll read it. Should I only apply to schools that my GPA and LSAT are the average for? Or how flexible should I be? How much of a reach is a reach for especially like higher credentialed schools?
That's the universal question.
It's tricky, isn't it? Yeah.
I prefer normally to do this with actual examples of real GPAs and real LSATs and knowing what the medians are at the schools that are under consideration. So I'm going to say that when this question comes up, my first response is always, it depends. Depends on so many factors. If we just eliminate everything else that is in this particular grouping, geography, background, what have you, and you just say it's GPA and LSAT, well, the question is, what are the medians and how close are you to them? If you are looking at schools where you're around the 50th on both, you clearly have a shot. That means in most cases you're getting in. So don't you think you should take some higher level shots, especially if you can hit the median on one of them and then be just below whatever the other median is so that you're not below on both of them. That's really helpful because then they're like, okay, you've got the solid GPA. We wish you had another point or two on the LSAT, but that's all right. We now think you're interesting.
Yeah. I saw a comment the other day that kind of blew my hair back a bit. It was so misguided, where someone said essentially the advice they were giving is, look, if you're not at or around the 75th percent on everything for medians, why bother? You're wasting your time. I was like, no, it's very stupid.
Sorry to dismiss that person.
Well, just mathematically, it's dumb.
Hey, man, here we're all above average. Didn't you know that?
Right. So as soon as I saw that, I was like, people really misunderstand how these medians work, what they mean. But at the same way, like I think if you can hit at least 50th on one thing, or if you have some peripheral qualifications that maybe make you a standout in other things, that can be more than enough to take a chance.
Well, look, there's many, many stories of splitters, reverse splitters, et cetera, having success. So right away, that tells you whatever that person was thinking or smoking was off base. It needs an upgrade in material. So I've seen plenty of splitters roll in and think, I don't know if I can get into this school. But in the right circumstances, if a school needs a particular asset or aspect, like they need a high GPA or a high LSAT score, and you fit that profile, they can start mixing and matching people. And don't think for a minute that law schools aren't kind of like rigorously watching the numbers. Hey, our numbers on LSAT are a little bit low. We need to bump them up. Oh, here's a splitter. We're not worried about GPA, but we do need that high LSAT. Welcome to the class.
There's a second part to this that actually reminds me of a question we took last time about imposter syndrome. Where, all right, maybe I get in just below the 50th percentile, but should I even bother with that? Like, am I an unqualified matriculant, essentially?
I love that question.
It comes up more than people might realize, where they're like, yeah, I could probably get in, but these numbers that I have compared to what the class looks like, I'm going to be outmatched from day one.
No.
That's just false.
If they think that you can do the work and let you in, you can pretty much do the work. That's why they let you in. I understand imposter syndrome and certainly have watched students go through it before. But you got to remember, everybody struggles with law school. Even that person out there with the really high numbers who looks really good on the internet and has a great profile on LSD doesn't mean anything. It means that ultimately when they get in there, they still have to learn the same things that you do. You have an equal shot at it. It's one of those things that is so pervasive that it's sad in that respect. But at the same time, the more we talk about it, the more people are aware of it. Like, hey, I got in because I'm a good applicant. They took me because they liked me and thought that I could do well here. Law schools aren't in the business of taking people they think are going to fail out or perform poorly. That's not what they're doing. So when they choose you, they're thinking, this person, we like the cut of their jib, to use a very old phrase.
That's a great line. It's a great line and a great point.
Then we think they fit in. And that's something that you can take to heart and believe in. They don't want people to leave, especially at the better law schools. It's incredibly important that they have a high level of retention. If they could, they would keep every single person and ultimately graduate them. They do not want to see attrition for academic reasons above all, because that is actually a reflection of a failure on their part, not yours.
Well put. Cut of their jib. There's a question or a couple questions here about part-time programs.
Hit me.
Hit you. Happily. Can you please provide some information on part-time law school? Is it a good option, or should we stick to full-time day programs?
That is a really broad question.
Yeah, can you please provide some information on part-time law school? It's easy to answer. but I don't know that it'd be satisfactory.
They are there and they exist.
They exist, yeah.
The question really isn't so much about that. It's like, look, is it legit? Should I go down this pathway? And the answer, unsurprisingly, is it really depends. It depends on the program, and it depends upon why you're choosing it, as well as what you're doing with the remaining time that you have. I will tell you a place where I've seen a number of part-time programs go through, and that is Washington, D.C.
D.C.
Because a lot of times, especially with like patent examiners, worked with them before, and they're like, look, I love my job. I want to come back here and kind of like continue on. And I'm a really set position. For me to quit would actually set me back considerably. So they roll into a part-time program, and that allows them to continue working while gaining this experience. And yeah, life suffers for more than a few years, but at the end of it, they walk out with not only the job, but a degree and then the leverage to, expand their position, salary, what have you. You also see this with people who have really fairly high-powered corporate jobs. They're doing that. And I think that's when it becomes a really good option in terms of like part-time. Is like it makes a whole lot of sense. The thing to remember is that part-time's tough because you work all day and guess what you get to do at night? You're not relaxing. There's no Netflix and chill. There's law school and suffer. And that's a 12-hour day minimum. Yeah. And they still pile the work on because they're like, look, you got to get through this. You may not be in as many classes, but we still need to like give you this information. So it's great though, because a lot of times the people you're in class with end up having a lot of work experience and they're committed to their career. So you're meeting other people who are equally committed. So I think you have to look at your reasons for it and understand whether or not those are strong enough to kind of like support that. In general, if I were to go back to law school, I'd take the full-time day program. But there are some people I have for sure have said, go to the part-time program. You're going to a good program. Your situation is perfect for it. Go ahead and do it.
Yeah. Business school does a lot of this too. And I know plenty of people who've done like a part-time MBA. And it worked out great. It was exactly the right decision.
Yeah. Now there's a second part to this question, John.
You waiting on me or are you going to read it?
I'll read it. Right. I would like thoughts on part-time or ABA-approved online courses. Would I be missing out on important connections and opportunities by going that route? And if I did an online program not in my state, would I be underprepared for the bar in my own state? You want to start with that one?
It's a lot to unpack.
Do you think you'll miss out on connections? Let's start with that.
Yeah, and that was my first comment was going to be that you very well could. I think doing anything online these days always comes with the risk of, the human touch. You could lose that sense of community that a lot of what law school is meant to be about, I think, occasionally lacks when you go online.
Yeah, I mean, it's the boot camp theory. You put a bunch of Marines into boot camp and they come out after, the 9 weeks or however long it is, and they're like, we went through hell together. Mm-hmm. And then they're able to bond that way. Law school has a similar aspect to it where it's like we're all stuck in this boat together, suffering through this, studying and what have you. It's part-time has that element too, although because most people have less free time, they don't get quite the same intensity level and connection level with other people around them, but it's still there. Online is really a very special beast here because it's easy enough to go to a Zoom meeting, do the meeting, and then turn it off, and then it's right back to you. Mm-hmm. So if you're going to make those connections, you're going to have to reach out and work even harder to do it. So in general, would I say, are you missing out on important connections and opportunities? Yeah, I actually do think that is the case. So what about the idea of an online program not in my state being underprepared for the bar?
I mean, again, that worries me a bit too.
Here's the thing. It depends on it. If we're going to talk about just about ABA approved online ones, the grounding that you're getting overall is supposed to be good enough and broad enough that you'd be prepared for any state. It's like when you get into a really small situation where I would start to have some concerns, but you're going to have to go do a whole bar preparation thing that is going to be added on top of, the end of law school and into the summer after law school. When you get to the end anyway, everybody does that. So I don't think that to me is the biggest concern. The bigger concern to me is that some online programs are not well received by employers, and you lose a lot because, they talk about the hallowed halls and, walking through campus and meeting people and being in class. That is a unique experience, and you lose all of that with the typical online program. So I'd be a little bit more concerned there.
That's part of the reason we've seen so many deferrals the last year and a half, is because everything went mandatory remote. And that just didn't appeal to a lot of applicants, and I understand why.
It's funny because I could have sworn that someone had asked me about scholarships in relation to part-time programs. Maybe that'll come up later, but I'm going to answer it anyway since we're talking about part-time programs. The one thing I will say is that the scholarship pool for part-time programs is less than it is relative to the full-time programs. So that's something to consider as well. They just don't have as much money to hand out on a proportional basis as the typical regular full-time program. So that's another place where you might see a bit of a shortfall. And yes, the programs are often cheaper, but they do last longer. So just take a look at that as well and keep that in mind when you're looking at this.
Well, partial credit, by the way, to your memory. Someone did ask you that question. It was me about 45 minutes ago.
No, it came up. We were talking about it.
It came up as you and I were talking about it.
No, but there was a reason I knew that, and I'd been thinking about it because I know it came up last week in relation to this. So, yes, you get credit, but whoever that was that asked me that last week, they get credit too.
They deserve more. Yeah.
I have remembered the answer and provided it. So
I'm impressed you remembered the question. Not from our conversation, but just in general. That's funny.
Let's move on.
So that first half, really, of questions was all about, as you said, the timing of things and some specialization, school choice stuff. Obviously, the big bulk of questions that we tend to get are about application components. I think that's the transition we'll make.
That is exactly the case. And our friend Mike Spivey made sure to give us a hard time by throwing out some questions that I know he gets asked all the time, is whether schools average scores, how many people are going to apply, should you use contractions? And I gave him a one-line answer on Twitter for it. But it was nice because I was able to have a conversation with him about some of the things we were talking about, the questions that people were asking. He's like, these kinds of questions are just so common. We answer them all the time. I see you answering them all the time. Mm-hmm. And so it's kind of cool. And he asked me to specifically shout out his podcast that he just did. I can't remember the name of the guy. It's like, I'm not going to remember it. I will crucify it if I were to actually use it. But apparently he's been podcasting with some pretty famous people recently, and it's a very interesting episode, which I have not listened to yet, but I told him I'd mention it.
Yeah, I haven't had a chance either, but I did see him mentioning it on Twitter, and I liked his tweets.
I retweeted it, and I was like, I will mention it, but we had that conversation last Thursday, and I've forgotten in the interim.
Who could blame you?
So let's move on to the actual components of the application.
Okay.
John, the first question is about resumes. What are the do's and don'ts for resume writing? For example, should you list every club you were involved in during undergrad?
Again, some of these questions, I don't know that there's a perfect answer to them. Every club, if there were 2. Every club, if there were 22. So much of this is contextual, and so much, I think, too, is about, you've talked about this a lot before, about how much of this hinges not so much in the content itself, but the presentation of it. So I would say do what feels reasonable, but you don't have to note every, this one semester I played chess twice. You don't have to get into those kind of details, nor should you. If I'm reading that as an admissions comm person, I'm going to get frustrated.
Yeah, to me, it's about shaping the vision of how you're trying to apply and tailoring your resume to kind of reflect that portrait that you are painting. If you have just a few items that you were involved in and clubs and so forth, yeah, you can list them because they're not taking up a huge amount of space. But if you've got like 3 leadership positions and then 15 membership positions, trust me, no one cares about your membership. They want to see actual action and activity. Somebody who's just a joiner who's in like 10, 12, 15 clubs, it doesn't look impressive. It looks like you're actually padding the resume with meaningless things that you weren't really committed to. And I don't mean that harshly. I just mean that's realistically what ends up happening when people are trying to look at this. At least as far as how this all goes together. The question continues on and said, if you wrote for a magazine during an internship, should you add links to the articles? How long should the resume be? First off, unless you've done something pretty spectacular, I really hesitate to watch resumes go over 1 page. So I would keep that in mind. Nobody wants to start flipping through a resume. And it's really, when it comes down to undergraduates and people who've been in the workforce less than, say, 5 to 10 years, it's going to be really hard for you to argue to me that your resume should be more than a page. There are exceptions, and I've seen them. So it's going to be relatively short. And that means that a lot of the things you might think about listing, you now have to perform triage. You have to say to yourself, what's the highest point value from mentioning this? And sometimes you end up being crammed, but you're also trying to shape what the vision is. Let's say that you've come in and you're like, I am really interested in the volunteer charitable work that I've done. I started this charity when I was in college. Well, now the activities that you list out should start to try to connect to that, the jobs that you've had. You're trying to connect with that vision and present that particular vision. Sometimes people come in with something completely different. That they were paralegals and they have a lot of legal experience. Great, start listing all the things that relate to that. So you have to think about this. This isn't just like, here's what I did. It's more about how can I present myself in such a way that it's going to look as if I had a plan and a vision, even if you didn't.
Yeah. This is also one of those categories where I think hearing what to do and actually working with someone who can shape it on your behalf make a world of difference. This is one of those rare times where I would strongly encourage people to consider getting a consultant, some kind of professional help. Your resume is probably not going to blow anything for you, but it is the sort of thing where a professional can help you out a lot.
Yeah, and when we go back to the original question, what are the do's and don'ts for resume writing? That is way beyond the scope of what we can talk about here, because trust me, people have talked about it on the internet with far more authority and detail than we ever could in a podcast of this length. It's exactly what you think it is, that you're trying to shape that vision of who you are and show that you had responsibility and that you're the type of person from a law student standpoint who looks like they are accomplished, who are achieving things, who are moving forward. Law school becomes another logical step in that career. So it's almost impossible to answer on a broad base like this. You'd have to begin looking at a resume. And that's the point when I can say, don't put that in there. But why isn't this in here? Don't list every interest that you had. I don't want to read about it. And don't tell me that you know Microsoft Windows Suite. I don't care. We expect that you do at this point because you're a citizen of the modern era. It's those kinds of things where you're like, wait, am I adding this because I think it should be there, or I'm adding it because it says something useful about me? And that's the best piece of advice you can ever get with the resume.
Yeah. I saw a resume, this has been years ago, but one of the skills listed was email. One word, email. I was like, well, I would hope so.
What does that mean? You read it? You write it?
You've mastered it.
I'm an email reader.
There are a couple more resume questions I think we can pin to this. Because they're good. You want me to take the second one?
Yeah.
All right. This was a specific person talking about their own situation. I'm a waitress in my 30s. I've traveled around, worked several restaurant and catering gigs. So my employment section is long. I've never been fired for cause from a job, but should I write an addendum explaining why? In other words, why this person's gone through so many different positions or organizations or kitchens?
Yeah, they're not saying why they've never been fired.
Right.
Which would be my first, kind of response. Wait, you don't need to tell them why you haven't been fired. That's a good thing. But no, why is there such seasonality here? I'd be really interested in asking this person, what is your personal statement going to look like?
Mm-hmm.
Because I want to know if there's any overlap here and whether or not this kind of like wandering aspect is something that you're going to mention, because there are people out there, and we all know them, who are just like world travelers. They don't care. They just want to go someplace new and see something interesting and have a great experience. And I think that's a really cool mindset to have. And that's something that can certainly be conveyed, not just in a personal statement, but if not in a personal statement, there may very well be some value in saying, look, this is what I've been doing, and I've had so many fantastic experiences. I worked a beach bar in the Seychelles and, met all these people from Europe and what have you. And then I was down in Panama and that kind of stuff. If you can do something like that, all of a sudden it becomes not just that you were wandering from job to job, but almost glamorous. And I can't tell whether or not that's the case. Seasonal work often suggests some kind of tourist location. Tourist locations, as both you and I know from having lived in a couple of them, are really cool and have a lot to recommend them. There's often a lot of experiences. So I think if you might want to explain that in some particular way. How far back do you go? You can't just list job after job over the past like 12 or 15 years, especially if you've got like 1 to 3 or 4 of them every year. It's just like, okay, we see. I would summarize it instead, but like I've done a variety of restaurant work over this period of time continuously in the following locations, and just summarize it that way so they can get the gist and move on from it.
Yeah. That industry too, food and beverage, it's pretty nomadic for a lot of people, especially people in their 20s and 30s. But yeah, I take your point. There's a fine line sometimes between the glamour of like a bohemian approach and, well, just vagrancy.
Well, you and I lived in Hilton Head, and that is a tourist island in South Carolina, and a lovely place. But we knew people who were there, just for the summer, sometimes just for the year, and they were like, "Look, I'm going to work, and then I'm going to party, and I'm going to do that every single day, and then I'm going to leave after 3 months." And you know what? Those people had a lot of fun, and we had a lot of fun with them.
Yes, we did. But they'd come back every summer and work a different gig. This summer they're fixing jet skis, and that summer they're a line cook. So again, it can look really scattered, but you can explain it.
Yeah. And it makes sense. You just have to say, how do I shape that presentation? Because sometimes it feels like, man, I haven't done anything. I've just been working at a bunch of restaurants for our last, 12 plus years. It's like, well, wait a second, though. Was this in pursuit of something, in service of something? And instead of making just this long list, summarize it. That's a really effective tool when you have a lot of jobs that are really similar, because anybody reading it's like, oh, they're just not going to list everything, but they're telling me what they did. That's good enough.
Take it.
Let's move on.
All right. You want to take the next one?
I do. It's the old YX question. Why should you attend this school, or why do you want to attend this school? And before I even say anything about the question, I will say that I wrote a blog post a while back, maybe it was last year, which means it was probably 3 years ago. It's called The Trap of YX Essays. So if you are grappling with what to write, that will help you understand better what not to write. But in this case, the person asks, in addition to the personal statement, should we do a YX essay even if the school does not request it? So, school didn't ask for it, and then you come calling with your YX. That's not the time for it. They didn't ask for it. Give them what they ask for first, and save this for the letter of continued interest. This is the kind of thing where you just keep it in your back pocket, and if it's needed later on, if you don't get in, you can shoot them a message back and kind of shape those elements into it, especially if you got something compelling to say about it. But I'm not a big fan of producing works and content that is not being directly requested by the school. It also means that if they do request something, do what you can to write it, unless writing it isn't going to help. Score increases is a big one that I've been asked about recently. Oh, I was listening to the dean and they said any score above 3 points, you should write us and explain. I'm like, no, that's just a trap, because now they're trying to see what you're going to say. And more often than not, people damage themselves with their explanations. Oh, I studied harder. I studied more. I studied longer. So you didn't take it seriously the first time is what I just read. That's what you want to kind of avoid here. But in this case, I'd save that for the end game, if that's where you end up. And if you don't need it at the end, well, good. You just saved yourself some time.
Yeah, that's perfect. Don't give them more than they ask for when they haven't even made a decision yet.
Keep this in mind when you're writing elements of the essay. It's a double-edged sword. It can help you if executed well, and it can hurt you if you don't execute it well. And a lot of times people think, no, I just need to do everything. I'm like, no, you need to add this kind of disclaimer. I need to do everything well. If you can't do something well, that's when you start trying to move yourself around it and think about, well, maybe I shouldn't write this. You see this with diversity essays a lot, where somebody who does not have traditional diversity elements goes out and starts saying, well, I think I can present myself as being a diverse element to the school. And they start to engineer this kind of explanation. And I always look at those and I'm like, because every person who reads this will know exactly what you're doing because they've seen it thousands of times before. Let's bring real diversity to the table when we have it. Let's not make it up. And sometimes it's borderline. So you have to, it's a case by case basis, but that's a really good example of like be careful about what you turn in and write.
It is. Yeah. One of the first questions we answered was about reach schools and what makes a reach school and what puts it closer to hand, more in reach. These are the things that can help make or break those dense moments.
Yeah. The problem is there's not one answer. I think a lot of law students, or at least applicants to law school, are like, there is a true holy grail answer to everything. There is not. I wish there was, because then we could write them all down and then just kind of like drop the stack of papers and walk off, mic drop us. Be like, hey, there's all the golden answers. The problem is I might tell one person something and then the next person comes with a similar question, but their background is different enough that it changes my answer. This is why we do admissions consulting in the first place, is because everybody is different. There is no one perfect answer. And on that note, our next question, Jon, is what is the most ideal structure for a personal statement?
Yeah, you really set that one up for me. Thank
you.
I sure
did.
What an alley-oop. I don't want to get too deep into this in large part because I think you've already provided so many resources that answer it better than we could chatting here. I'll link a blog post that's the ultimate law school guide to the personal statement. It's got tons of resources in it. From, I know, like a webinar I think you participated in and did, to several other articles. There's so much good information already in place for this question. I'm going to take a shortcut and just rely on that.
I might redo that webinar at some point here because it's been a few years and our audio setup is significantly better now. I don't know if I'll get to it this fall because this fall is just super busy, but probably within the next year, because it is a really good webinar. And one of the things that it shows is that there isn't an ideal structure because there is no one ideal life to live. There's no one ideal person except maybe Rob Lowe. And so unless
you pick. Good pick.
He's a top shelf pick. There's a few I could throw in there. Brad Pitt would be another one. But when you take a look at the way people are, you can't put them into one single structure. If there was a perfect structure that people used over and over again, it would soon not be the perfect structure. It would become tiresome and then people would get sick of it. What's great about reading essays is the diversity of what people present, how they speak their minds, the voices that they have. Mm-hmm. That is what I always find fascinating. And one of the great things about like helping students with personal statements is you're unearthing sometimes what is a true gem inside something that is struggling to get out. So I wouldn't say there's an ideal structure for a personal statement because I've seen everything under the sun work. It's about execution, not kind of like pigeonholing yourself into a very certain type of structure to use.
Yeah. I find a lot of the advice we give on personal statements often boils down to what not to do, as opposed to this is the gold standard template.
The best piece of advice I can give for anybody in the personal statement is this: every word counts. I've had people send me personal statements and I'm like, yeah, there's a missing word over here. So you didn't look at it closely enough before sending it along. What do you think's going to happen when the law school sees that? They're like, you didn't care. You're sloppy. In a contract, you better have everything covered. You do a typical transactional contract and it's just brutal. It's page after page of the worst minutia you've ever seen. And then all of a sudden, somebody's forgotten a word and it completely changes the meaning of what's there. Don't be that person. Same thing with your personal statement. Get it right. Read it 50 times before giving it to any other person and consider every single word. Sometimes you see the same word used 3 sentences in a row, and I'm like, come on. Mm-hmm. If you read that out loud, you would have heard it and thought, I got to change one of those.
Yeah.
I'm getting angry about it.
It's one of the touchier things. In fact, to double down on this, the next question we have begins to illustrate just why we're so emphatic and invested, which is this. Another abstract one, but how can a personal statement, letters of rec, other aspects of your application help or hurt an LSAT score? Again, I think we could take this one from the obvious and say the better they are, the less your score is going to matter if it's low.
It's an interesting question because I think it's predicated upon the idea of like, look, the score is all that really matters. Does this other stuff really matter? Can it help or hurt? And of course, you got to be real careful when you start thinking that way. Yes, your scores get you in the door. Guess what keeps you out? Bad personal statements, terrible letters of recommendation, other problems with your app. I have said this before. I've seen people with perfect scores get rejected at many, many good schools, including schools that you would never think they get rejected from because they completely screwed up the remaining parts of their application. And so, yes, numbers dominate, but really great applicants back their numbers up with all these elements lined up perfectly. They actually think about how they're going to present themselves, and things like their letters of rec dovetail with their personal statement, which dovetails with any addenda they may actually write. Mm-hmm. So it's the funny thing. You wouldn't say overall they're the biggest part of the application, but like any other piece, they can be determinative, and that makes them very important.
Yeah. Well, we've seen this very close to home. We had a former instructor of ours in New York, whose situation you probably recall, who after working for us applied to law school, 175, 3.9, like great on paper, didn't get in anywhere. I'm talking like not Texas, not Virginia, not Duke, nowhere. And he came to us after going a bit rogue. It's like, fellas, help, what happened? And we both read his personal statement. We're like, this happened. This is what happened. And we wrote it, applied the next year, went to Harvard.
And that's what happens is sometimes you have to like learn that lesson. It's a harsh lesson to learn over the course of a year. But if, you know, especially at the top schools, they expect your numbers to be good. Mm-hmm. You having great numbers at the top schools puts you in contention. That's a really important pool to be in. However, guess what separates the pack out? All those other pieces. So yeah, they can be hugely important and they can make or break your app. Again, it's going to change from school to school. At a lower ranked school, they might say to themselves, we can let this go and get the numbers in there. But there's a certain point where you can't keep dropping down the list in terms of rankings because those schools will start yield protecting you. Oh, 175.39 is not going here. I'm not going to accept that person. And now you were like, I was a lock to get in there and they yield protected you and you're out. And now you're scrambling to say, no, guys, I totally will go. That's not the position you want to be in. You've just abdicated all power at that point.
Yeah. It's amazing how many moving parts there are into this and how many misconceptions and just almost alchemy there is to it. Because there's no perfect thing and there's no single right answer.
Yeah. You're creating a passport when you apply and you want a very certain look and angular attack on applications. You can't just randomly make that happen. It does happen on occasion, but more often than not, it's the product of actual considered thought and planning. That's what all of this discussion is like, think about what you're doing. Think about how this matches up the other pieces because it all works in concert.
Yeah. Angular attack. I like that phrase.
Ah, yeah.
Yeah, cut of your jib.
My mainsail.
Yes, sir.
All right. Let's go to the last question. It says, I applied with a GRE and no LSAT last cycle. No bites. This cycle, I'm applying with the LSAT. Do I need to substantively change my personal statement? So let's look at that in two pieces. Mm-hmm. Applied last time with a GRE and no LSAT. All right, you can do this. Obviously, there's a number of schools that are GRE only acceptors, a large number these days. Mm-hmm. Here's the problem. It's still not a big part of admissions. It's not even 5% of admissions last time I checked. And in many instances, these schools are still very uncertain about how the GRE is working and whether or not it really produces law students that they can trust in terms of performance and outcomes. The LSAT typically doesn't have that problem. You get a certain score in the LSAT, these schools are like, you're good enough. We now are no longer worried about your ability to like do the work. We want to know whether or not you're a good citizen of the law school and we'll add to it.
Yeah.
So I think that'll change eventually, John, but the rate of change is super slow. I would have thought by now the GRE would be more widely accepted. It's just not making the inroads. There are practical rules for that with the ABA. But right now, if you're applying GRE only, even with perfect scores, you are not in the power position. You will always be second to LSAT only students or students with an LSAT score. And as I've said previously, you apply with both. They ignore your GRE and they must use your LSAT score. That means the GRE is instantaneously devalued compared to the LSAT. So keep that in mind. Now, this person figured that out one way or the other, and now they're back. Now it's coming in hot with an LSAT, which I like to hear. Now you're getting that full serious consideration. Should we change our personal statement after last year to this year? That's a tougher question, in my opinion.
Yeah, I suggests we probably both need to read it. What did you write?
Yeah, let's say we can't. We can't.
Let's save that.
Here's the thing, because this question comes up more frequently than you'd think. I think if you applied the prior year and you did not get in, you must change. That's kind of like my baseline position. Now, if you had a bunch of acceptances and you just were not thrilled with it, or you weren't thrilled with the scholarship money, okay, that means that your app worked. But what we know right now is that your application did not work. And so consequently, we're in a position where if we go ahead and say, let's just use all the same items, well, you're at a disadvantage, especially because almost certainly your letters of recommendation are going to be substantively the same. So to me, I think that you should change your personal statement here. Now, you can still use the same topic and parts of it at worst. So I think if that's the case, you can go ahead and make changes to it. The more, the merrier. But I think at least some change has to actually occur.
I think schools appreciate that too. It wasn't just rubber stamped back in. You considered it. You probably improved it. Most rewrites tend to get better.
Yeah. There's exceptions here.
Yeah, sure there are. Especially if you seek out some qualified help with that.
There's that. There's also, we've seen essays before. It's like, this is really good. This wasn't the problem. The problem was your LSAT score was 10 points below their median. Right. Now you've rectified that situation. They're going to remember you. This was a memorable thing. But the only way to figure that out is to talk to somebody who actually has done it before and who has seen a lot of these essays. And that's not something that everybody has access to. So my default is typically change, especially if you didn't get in anywhere, unless you're absolutely certain that you have utterly destroyed, nailed that essay, and it is just fantastic and cannot be improved upon. Yeah. That's rare, though.
The GRE was literally the only thing holding you back.
Yeah, I'd say that was a big problem here, and that's not something that everybody's going to be able to point to. Almost every part of your application can be improved, even just incrementally. Every little bit helps. Make yourself better, stronger, more powerful. That's what the whole admissions process is about. Because and sometimes people will say to me, I'm sick of this process. And my response is always the same. I understand. I hear you. I sympathize. However, this could be the difference in tens, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt. You do not want to kind of like shirk your duties now. Put all your efforts into it, because at the end of the day, if you can get into these schools and kind of have convinced them through all the different pieces of your application that you are a really desirable candidate, all of a sudden they start to put the money out, and that's where the real payoff becomes. The goal here is to pay as little as possible for law school. That's what the LSAT does for you. That's what admissions consulting does for you. That's what extra time spent on all these pieces will do for you. It lowers the final bill by putting a little bit of time, money, effort, investment into the front part of the process.
Yeah, well worth it no matter how you slice it. I'll ask you one final question, because I'm curious if you're given to the same suspicions about the GRE that I am, the lack of love. I'm guessing that the algorithm or the metrics used to calculate rankings simply haven't figured out what to do with GRE scores yet. They know how to treat LSATs. They know how to, compute with that. And then you get this other test. It still feels a little bit maybe unexplored or random. Do you think that's why it hasn't broken through the way, say, it did against the GMAT?
I can see that. I think it's a complicated situation. When the ABA basically tells these schools that you have to use the LSAT if one exists, they are telling them quite clearly that it's not as important. And I haven't looked at the numbers on the rankings and things like that to be able to say with any certainty here. But certainly when you come through this, I know the schools, they're not convinced yet. Some schools are being a little more aggressive with the GRE. If I recall, Georgetown and Harvard took a lot of GRE students. I'll be very interested to see how that works out going forward. But there are plenty of schools out there who haven't taken many. And the thing about Harvard and Georgetown is these are two of the larger law schools out there. So the fact that they would feel greater latitude doesn't surprise me. A smaller school might say, we can't risk it. So right now, it's all LSAT. It's still an LSAT world.
Yes, it is.
Got anything else to add, John?
No. I'm waiting for the power to go out here. LA's having a once-a-year storm, apparently.
I thought I was hearing flight pattern. Is that thunder?
want to live at the airport. Feels like that sometimes. No, that's actual thunder.
It must be heat thunder.
Must be. Whether it came through in the audio or not, I don't know, but I think we should wrap it up before the place goes dark.
Well, at this point, I could carry it out myself, so you'd actually be all good, but let's go ahead and call it. If you get a chance, please subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, or anywhere else you may find it. And if you've enjoyed it, please leave us a comment and a rating. And if you have any questions, probably be a little bit of time before we do another mailbag, but we will, as always, get to it. Please send those to lsatpodcast@powerscore.com. On behalf of Jon and myself, we hope this was helpful. Have a great week. Stay safe.